Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I will talk about geopolitics, but I will be using maps, so I'm just gonna say hello, please give thumbs up, subscribe and turn on notifications. And by the way, these topics seem not to be very popular with YouTube, so please share the link. Do it privately in chats, in groups, because otherwise this will not reach many people. I'm speaking from experience. Once a video like this hits a certain level, becomes popular in the United States, it tends to hit a glass ceiling and not be propagated anymore. So that said, let's go straight on to it, geopolitics. Let's get on with it. So here we have the world as we know it on Google Earth. And we can see here the countries and the situation at the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. The only countries remaining of the axis of evil are Cuba and North Korea. And I've also included Iran, since that is a drug smuggling country that helped to smuggle heroin from Afghanistan to Europe during the 1980s, in cooperation with the Soviet Union. China I have in a special color because that's a case by itself with a totally different and own view of the world and plan. And then something happened. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Fidel Castro in Cuba, he had already been trying for a long time to take control over Venezuela, including by magnicidio of President Carlos Andrés Pérez in 1989, which failed due to the Venezuelan intelligence capturing the case, the plan. However, there was some infiltration because the would-be assassin was allowed to stay in the presidential palace. In 1992, he tried to make a military coup d'etat, which failed, and he went to jail. But the infiltrator remained. He was pardoned. He ran for election in 1998, and in 1999, he was installed as president in Venezuela, and he rapidly did away with the constitutional democracy, and Venezuela has been a dictatorship ever since. So beware, if you let a would-be dictator, a Manchurian candidate, assume the presidency, you may lose your democracy forever. It's very hard to stop it. Next thing that happened was that Russia came back as a dictatorship when Vladimir Putin assumed power, and with it, Belarus, which always remained a dictatorship, but now together with Russia. And then Daniel Ortega took power in the elections in Nicaragua and also installed a permanent dictatorship there. Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are now fierce dictatorship, repressive regimes that conduct crimes against humanity, and in Venezuela's case, even genocide. And then Russia started to expand. Well, they never really stopped after Putin took office. So they got into Georgia, occupied a couple of provinces in Georgia, and have stayed there ever since. And then they went into Ukraine, Crimea, which erroneously is marked red on this map, it should be yellow, and Donbass in 2014. And then the war, full-scale war, started 3 years ago. And in the Americas, if we go back there, we can see that it's not only Nicaragua and Venezuela that they've tried to take. It's the only two countries that they have completely assumed power over, but they have tried also with many others. And I would say that perhaps they have almost completely assumed power in Bolivia. They tried in Ecuador and Peru, but have not been totally successful. And in Honduras, the same thing. In some of these countries now, the president is on their side. In Colombia, there has been a long fight, but at present, they've finally from their point of view, managed to get elected a leftist president, ex-guerrilla member, Gustavo Petro. And the ELN guerrilla is still active. And the ELN, although created inside Colombia, is really a front for Cuba and for Venezuela. And they have more or less at the same time as Trump assumed the presidency in the United States, the ELN started an offensive to take even more territory and drive out the farmers in order to expand the coca plantations on the border to Venezuela. That way they compete out the private cartels, and they grow the coca and transport it to Venezuela, where it's refined on an industrial scale and then transported out over the world. So this is the cocaine cartel that uses cocaine as a weapon that pays for itself and that is used to conquer other countries. It generates an enormous amount of revenue, money that has to be laundered. I'll get back to that in a moment. We can see here the lines that connect Havana, Caracas, Managua, and Moscow. That's the main axis in this organization. And there are also cocaine smuggling connections to, as I said, Honduras, Colombia, obviously, Bolivia, and Iran, and even North Korea. And then we have the countries that help Russia militarily in the war against Ukraine. Iran and North Korea. And now, lately, a new and very unexpected ally that is helping Russia, and that is the United States of America. After Trump took office, this country, his policy has effectively helped Russia tremendously. I'm aware of that there are people who claim, people who have worked in KGB, who say, as a matter of fact, that Trump was recruited by the KGB and is a Russian asset or even agent. That is really a moot point at this point of time, because the fact is that Trump is helping Russia tremendously. So whether he is an agent or not really doesn't matter anymore. Now, I would like to get into two particular points here. First, back to South Florida, where I lived for many years, because I mentioned the money laundering, and that is a crucial place on the map for that activity. And then we'll go to the Baltic Sea and Russia's attempts to cut cables over the Baltic Sea, cables that are essential for the defense of the eastern part of NATO, the Baltic republics. Miami, it turns out, is a key city for understanding the present-day geopolitical situation. Miami in the 80s was just a sleepy little small town. But then came the cocaine cowboys. Pablo Escobar in Colombia had this idea to convert cocaine into a big product. Instead of importing it, smuggling it from Ecuador and smuggling it in small scale, he started growing it in Colombia. And the cocaine cowboys in Miami, a few Colombian friends in a small high school, they decided, we are going to market it here. And with the help of a woman who was the link between the two, and a German pilot who flew the cocaine in airplanes from Colombia to the Bahamas, and from there in speedboats over to Miami. It got in. But Miami being a sleepy town, they needed to create a market. They had the funds. Cocaine is very expensive. They had a lot of income. And in order to make this economy grow, they invested in the entertainment industry in Miami, in discos, in hotels. And Miami became what it is and what we know from Miami Vice, the TV series that reflects those years. And this continued until they finally went to jail after the year 2000 for, this is insane, but he actually went to jail for having paid his attorney with money that he couldn't show where the legal source was. So for many years, that's an absolutely crazy part of the history of Miami. If you haven't seen a documentary about the cocaine cowboys, take a look at it. And also Pablo Escobar. And Pablo Escobar, this German pilot I mentioned, he took some pictures of Pablo Escobar unloading cocaine together with Daniel Ortega, who back then was the dictator of Nicaragua, and now again is the dictator of Nicaragua. And they cooperated with Fidel Castro in Cuba. So already then it was the cocaine cartel in Medellin, Colombia, Nicaragua with Ortega, Cuba with Castro, and then up to Miami. And as you know, Miami is full of Cuban immigrants. And now there are also a lot of Russian oligarchs. If we take a look at the map, we see here on this little island at the Miami harbor entrance, Fisher Island, that's full of Russian oligarchs. Going up the coast, not too far away, we find Mar-a-Lago. And who's there? Donald Trump. And in between, there are lots of testaferros. That's a Spanish term for people who invest the money of the criminal organization, of the cartel. Because after they took over Venezuela, Venezuela became the hub of this cocaine cartel. The processing hub. They eventually destroyed the economy, and so they could no longer smuggle it out via Venezuela, but it's processed in Venezuela. Thousands of tons of cocaine. And Venezuelan testaferros have settled here in this area of South Florida. The main spot is actually in Palm Beach. And the social center in that area where they meet the people of wealth is Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump's place. So all of this connects. This tremendous amount of coca dollars that needs to be invested, and lots of it has been invested in Miami. It's cocaine that has made Miami into the town it is today. People coming with suitcases full of cash, buying the apartments and converting the city to what we see today, this skyline. And also, I'm sure a lot of the money has gone into financing startups, the dot-com boom, the angel money. And here we're talking about not angel dust, but money from the cocaine. And by the way, there is a saying in Miami, people remember the day it snowed in Miami. One day in history it has snowed in Miami in the 1980s. But you know what? It would have been more probable for cocaine to fall out of the sky in Miami than for snow to fall, because that's how much cocaine passed there. I had my business there. I saw people around me working with smuggling cocaine, but I could do nothing. And well, of course I reported it to the police, but it was kind of meaningless. They were all over. Miami is a cocaine town, and all that money goes into the US economy. And although I cannot prove it, I'm sure a lot of it goes into tech companies, high-risk investments, because they don't really need a return on investment. What they need is for the money to go into a company and to be paid out. And once it's paid out, it's white money. Even if they lose half of it, they still launder the money. So now maybe you can figure out a probable origin for all that money in the dot-com boom. Those companies which today are backing Donald Trump. I mentioned that we have to learn from history. And I mentioned the coup, the Manchurian candidate, Hugo Chavez was his name, who was installed with the help of Fidel Castro in Venezuela, 1999, and who dismounted democracy swiftly. We have to learn from history that it's very easy for a Manchurian candidate to take over the levers of democracy, the levers of the state from the inside, and it can be done very quickly. And Venezuela was the first case in modern history, but not the last. They have tried it over and over. In one country they failed because they didn't do it properly, and that was Honduras 2009. But they have succeeded in Nicaragua with Daniel Ortega, and they've tried it in a number of other countries where the democratic institutions have fought back, like Ecuador. And now it's going on right now in Colombia and in Honduras. They succeeded the second time. So what's happening in the US now is very, very serious. And I hope the American people realize that their media are being censored already. They are already in censorship. And the social media too. This information has to be spread by chat. So please take this video link and spread it by chat so people get it. Because I'm sure that YouTube will not propagate this much. As soon as they discover what it's about, it will hit the glass ceiling. So to save the US, it's crucial to speak to friends and like-minded in private chats using apps like Telegram and Signal, and to act swiftly, decisively with the levers of government that exist. This is a matter of life and death for modern civilization. For the era that started in the 1700s, a quarter of a millennia ago, it could end now if we do not step up to our responsibility. This is the gravest threat we have faced since the 1700s. Now back to the video. Now let's have a look at the European theater of war, because this is where it happens. Russia started invading Georgia a number of years ago, and then Ukraine, and there is a full-scale war now in the middle of Europe, because make no mistake about it, this is the middle of Europe, the Donbas area. However, Putin has designs on more territories. Even if he were to take all of Georgia and all of Ukraine, he would not be satisfied. He also has designs on Moldova and on Kazakhstan in order to recover the former, quote, glory, end quote, of the Soviet Union. So, logically, he must also be after Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, thereby connecting the Kaliningrad area to the motherland Russia again. Just look at his access to the Baltic Sea. The geostrategical challenge for Russia has always, all through its history, been the access to the sea. In the 1700s, Russia managed to take Ingermanland from Sweden, or Inkria, and there they established the capital St. Petersburg. The capital was moved back to Moscow later. And then they took the Kaliningrad Oblast, former Königsberg, from Germany after the Second World War. But now, after having lost the conquered areas of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Russia has very little access to the Baltic Sea. It's just up in St. Petersburg. And then, even so, they have to pass through the Danish belts, where they have right of passage through an international convention from the 19th century. But the problem for us in the West is that Russia has access to the Baltic Sea, because that means that they can cut off our crucial underwater cables, communication cables, electricity cables, and they have done so between Finland and Estonia, between Sweden and Latvia, and I believe some to Lithuania as well. And those are acts of war. So, in reality, we have now looked at how to protect these cables, but it turns out to be quite challenging. Now, there is another option, of course, and that's to do a navy blockade in the Gulf of Finland and cut off all Russian ships from going out and in from St. Petersburg. War is war. If Russia wants war, that could be an appropriate response. Now let's have a look at Russia's other access to the sea. They have down in the Black Sea, Sevastopol, which they conquered from Ukraine, the Crimea, and Novorossiysk in the Russian area. But they have to go out through the Dardanelles in Turkey and Bosporus. And there too they have the right of passage through an international convention. But that would of course cease to be applicable in the case of a war with Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member. And if we go to the other extreme, to the Far East, Russia has a harbor in Vladivostok. But Vladivostok is inside Japan. In 1905, in the war between Russia and Japan, Russia sent a navy to rescue Vladivostok, and they went between Korea and Japan, but they were attacked by the Japanese navy there and destroyed. Some have said that they should have gone around Japan, but if they would have had to pass through the Kuril Islands up here, and then perhaps being spotted, so that the Japanese navy could have waited for them in the narrow strait north of Japan. So there is actually a wider strait between Korea and Japan. So maybe it wasn't the worst option. But considering that, we see that the Russians actually do not have much access to the ocean from Vladivostok. And on top of that, it's in an area they conquered from China. And it's very cold, just like Murmansk. Murmansk turns out to be Russia's best ocean harbor, but it's in the Arctic Ocean. So Russia has some geostrategical challenges, to put it mildly. Russia has one final way out to the ocean, and that's going through the Caspian Sea to Iran and then over land down to the Indian Ocean and use a port of Iran's. So the main geostrategical difficulty for Russia is access to the ocean. And if Russia, which it is doing, Russia is cutting off underwater cables. And reports say that they have a submarine specifically built for cutting off deep ocean cables. So then it becomes a reasonable war objective to cut Russia off from the oceans by blockading all of their ports, especially Murmansk and St. Petersburg, in order to protect the Baltic Sea and the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I've shown you a lot of maps, but there is one aspect that maybe is lost in all the geography, and that is the psychology. We have to understand what kind of regime the Putin regime is, the Russian regime. And it's the same as the Soviet. There is no difference. It's a continuation of the same KGB, which in turn inherits a lot of mentality from Tsar-era Russia, the imperialism. And that inherits things from way back in time. We can go back and read the Edda, the older Edda from Iceland, about Attila and Sigurd and Gudrun, and learn something about the mentality of the people from the steppes. It's a very cruel reading, but it helps us understand, because if we do not learn from history, we are forced to repeat it. And the kind of cruelty we see from Ukraine, which you will never see here on YouTube because it's filtered out. But when you see, Facebook, YouTube, all these kind of platforms are filtered, they're sanitized. You will never learn the whole truth by watching these media. If you want to, and also you can't spread information freely. The MAGA say we need freedom of expression. Well, guess what? We don't have it. We do not have it. So if we want to spread the truth, we have to resort to what we did in Venezuela, in the Venezuelan resistance, and that is the cranes. The cranes were there, they're flying off there. That is spread the word in chats, in platforms like Telegram, which they use in Ukraine, and Signal. WhatsApp, I don't trust because it's part of Meta. That's the way to spread the information and create groups with people you know and then connect to others, not too big groups. That's the way to get the word around. So anyway, the psychology. Putin has the psychology of a criminal. Let's look a little bit at this. We can see the world in two different ways: liberal democracy or authoritarian dictatorship. And in our system, liberal democracy, those who think like Putin, egotistical, will end up being the criminals. The intelligent ones will be the head of the criminals and try to infiltrate in companies, in politics, in the police, in the justice system, everywhere where they can get access to power and steal and rob. If they can do it under the cover of law, that's their goal. In the other system, they make the laws. It's a country of a system of rule of men and not of laws. And they declare what is the truth, what is the lie, what is permitted to say, and they proclaim we have freedom of expression as long as you don't say anything prohibited, because in that case that's the kind of situation we are facing. A battle between two systems, the good and the evil. And at the present time, as you saw in my maps, the evil thinks it's going to win. The same thing happened with Attila and Sigurd and his brother Gunnar. And I may be confused about the names. Maybe it was Gunnar and his brother Sigurd. Anyway, they had a sister called Gudrun who was married to Attila and had children with Attila. Well, that's another story. I'll leave it for a separate. History interests me, and I'm preparing videos about ancient history to learn from it. Because all these ancient stories about the battle between the good and the evil, they serve us today in order to learn from history and not repeat it. Because in our system we tend to think that everybody is good, but they're not. And the way we can learn to recognize evil and to understand what dramatic changes we have to take in our way of behaving, in our way of acting in front of this unmeasurable evil. We have to understand the forces we have to bring up inside us to confront this. They have done it in the past. Europe has always defeated this evil in the end. Pardon, a brief interruption for a message from our sponsor, so we can keep this channel active. If you study sediments, you owe it yourself to take a look at the Sedimeters from Lindorm.com. And if you don't, maybe you know some environmental expert or engineer who may find it useful. The Sedimeter is inserted into the sea bed, where it measures a vertical profile, so you can see things that happen both above and below the bottom. The Sedimeter determines the bed level with millimeter precision, and it's very useful for studying siltation, resuspension, sedimentation, and erosion. This SN4P model also functions as a Sedisonde, a free-fall penetrometer, that is dropped into the sediment where it measures the shear strength while simultaneously measuring the turbidity profile. This is a unique instrument and very portable. It's even possible to combine the functions of Sedison and Sedimeter by dropping it into the sediments to measure the shear strength and leave it in place to continue monitoring as a sedimeter. The newest Sedimeter model can also be used above the water, and it can be used to track both sediments and water level. It's a 48 centimeter instrument where the sections can be combined to much longer sensors. So go to lindom.com to read more about it and get a quote. Now, back to your video. The cranes. It's spring, the cranes have arrived.